When browsing for interesting motherboards, I came across this Super Micro board here. The big standout feature is that it has 6 built-in 10 gigabit ports on the board. And seeing that the board can be found for a relatively affordable price, this makes it a very good potential option for a 10 gigabit budget router. Today I want to take a look at this board, see how well it works as a router, see what type of issues I might run into using it as a router, and just see how the overall experience is. Before I get into this video, I want to thank Unix Surplus for providing me this motherboard for the making of this video. They're a great place to find boards like this and many other pieces of used server hardware that you might be interested in. Check them out in the links below. I first want to start by taking a look at the physical layout of this motherboard and what controllers are being used to make this work. Let's first take a look at the most exciting part of this board, which is these 6 10 gigabit connections. Each pair of these connections is powered by their own Intel X540 controller, and there is 3 of these total on the board. These Intel X540 controllers are often found in cards that look just like this and fit into a PCI Express slot, but in this case it's just built into the board on this system. These controllers are generally well regarded as being reliable controllers that work with almost every OS, including Windows, Linux, FreeBSD, and other versions of BSD. The main disadvantage of these controllers is that because they're a little bit older now, they don't support the 2.5 and 5 gigabit speeds, which actually came out after 10 gigabit base T. So this means while this system will link just fine at 10 gigabit and 1 gigabit speeds, if you have newer devices like motherboards or newer routers and modems that support 2.5 or 5 gigabit speeds, it'll link at 1 gigabit. My next thought when looking at these boards was these Intel X540 controllers are PCI Express X8 slots. So how are they connecting all of these to the CPU? This motherboard uses an Intel Xeon E3v3 platform. This is also very similar to something like Z97 or Z87 on the desktop and uses almost identical silicon. So that means the PCIe lanes on this platform is relatively limited. So 16 lanes from the CPU going to your main slots, plus a little bit more from the chipset. So I went to look at the manual of this motherboard to see if they had a block diagram of how these were all connected, because I want to know, can you actually max all these chips out, or how is that all laid out? But unfortunately, that manual doesn't seem to be easily findable for this board. And it seems like this board was designed for OEM use and to be sold to companies to use them in cloud-like environments or something like that, and not to be sold on the open market, likely meaning there's no publicly available manual that at least I could find easily. So I had to do a little bit of digging using tools like LSTopo and Linux to find out how this is all laid out. And when using those tools, it points to what's under this heatsink right here, which is a PEX8747 PCI Express switch. And what this switch does is it takes the X16 PCI Express Gen 3 link from the CPU and splits it to a total of 32 lanes. In this case, these are Gen 3 X8 slot right here, and then each one of these gets X8 from here. These only Gen 2 cards, so they get a Gen 2 X8 link from all of these. And while this does mean there's a bit of bandwidth sharing on this board, 10 gigabit connections in this layout are going to be significantly slower than the PCI Express bus, meaning that you can max out all of these 10 gigabit connections on this board at the same time without having any PCI Express issues. It also leaves X8 available for this slot to be used for an additional card. So something like a 40, 25, or maybe even a 2.5 or 5 gigabit jack can easily go into this slot without having any issues. The rest of this I/O on this board is provided through the chipset here, through its relatively slow DMI link, though it is still more than enough for the slower X4 slot on the bottom of this board, SATA slots, USB 3, and other devices on this board. Speaking about other devices, this system has an IPMI chip, which is really nice because a lot of the Xeons available to this platform don't have built-in iGPUs, meaning you have a graphics out here, even if your CPU doesn't have a built-in graphics processor. The IPMI chip on this motherboard also provides a little web page for remote management and configuring the system, and a remote KVM if you want to control it that way. There's also a dedicated IPMI network jack on here, so if you want to have a dedicated network for managing IPMI, you can do that. Some of the other features on this board include 6 SATA ports, 2 of which have power for using Super Micro SATA DOMs, which it includes 4 DDR3 slots. This can use UDIMM memory, but unfortunately this platform cannot use the cheaper and more available RDIMM memories. It also has a few more slots on the back, including 2 USB 3 ports, 2 USB 2 ports, and a serial port. It looks like a standard network jack, but this is actually a serial port. Looking at the form factor of this board, this looks like a standard MATX board, with room for 4 expansion slots and the standard MATX screw locations. But this board is actually a little bit longer than a standard MATX board, probably by about 5 or 6 centimeters. And if I put a standard MATX board up next to it, I can see this additional little gap of space that this board has that a standard MATX board doesn't. This additional space is likely needed for these extra Ethernet controllers and the PCI Express switch this board has, but what this means is it won't fit into a lot of MATX cases easily. This board will fit fine into larger cases that are designed for form factors like XL-ATX or eATX, but that might mean putting this relatively small board into a quite massive case and limit your case options quite a bit. So what I also had the opportunity to look at was a Super Micro 1U case that is designed for this Super Micro board and likely some other Super Micro boards. If you've ever used Super Micro boards in the past, this case is likely going to be fairly familiar to you, using a lot of the similar equipment Super Micro has used for many years, like hard drive trays, which is great because you can just reuse those trays from previous servers if you'd like in this one. Super Micro also generally does a quite good job when it comes to using close to ATX components, like a standard MATX mounting system as I mentioned earlier, ATX power connectors, and standard 4-pin fan connectors to run all the fans in this case. And other than that, this is a pretty standard 1U case with 4 3.5-inch hard drive SATA mounts in the front, a row of fans to help cool it, these are contra-rotating fans for redundancy and high airflow, a power board that allows you to use 2 power supplies in this system for redundant power or being able to switch power sources when the system is running, and spot for the board to go in. It also has a right angle slot so you can use one of the PCI Express X8 slots when this board is in the system too. And other than that, it just works and fills all the features of the board without any real issues. The only thing to note with this case is noise. If you're putting this in something like a server closet or a separate room, it's likely going to be fine. But if it's in a room with people or just put in a closet that you can hear through easily, you likely don't want to work with this case. First thing is, power supply fans are always running, even when it's shut down, and they're roughly a bit over 50 decibels. Turning the system on actually doesn't raise the noise level, because a lot of the noise is from these power supply fans. But when it does get under load, it gets into the 60-some decibel range, and this is not something you'd want to be in a room with all day. Now let's take a look at the power consumption of this system. For my initial power consumption tests, I ran both of the internal power supplies plugged into a little power splitter plugged into my power meter to test the full power of both power supplies being used. And when this system was shut down and not running at all, it was pulling about 22 watts from the wall. When it was idle in Windows, it was pulling about 65 watts from the wall. Idle in pfSense or other router applications with multiple network cards plugged in was about 80 watts. Under heavy router load, so this was moving about 10 gigabits of traffic with a couple of utilities like Snort running, was about 120 watts from the wall. And under maximum load using a utility like Prime 95, was about 165 watts from the wall. And with this case and cooling situation, even under max sustained load, I couldn't get the system to throttle down, overheat, or lose any performance during sustained workloads, which is great to see in something like a router that might have to do sustained work. But looking at those power consumption figures, I was thinking that's pretty high, especially for the off power consumption. So I was thinking maybe having 2 power supplies and this power splitter board wasn't the most efficient way to do it. So I tried just using a desktop ATX power supply. It was lower rated at only 80 plus gold, but it did result in significantly lower power consumption, with only about 10.5 watts of power consumption at idle on this system. Roughly 50 watts of power consumption under load in Windows, which is about a 15 watt drop versus these dual redundant power supplies, and under max Prime 95 load only pulling 135 watts compared to 165 watts with the dual redundant power supplies. I also tried using just one of these dual redundant power supplies and it dropped down to 160 watts versus 165 under max load and 18.5 watts when off compared to 22. So if your goal is to save a few watts, using a desktop ATX power supply is a lot more efficient than these dual redundant power supplies included in this system. Generally, under most of the routing tests I ran on this system, it's going to sit at less than 100 watts from the wall and not ramp up the fans at all. This power consumption of the system is still significantly more than a lot of the lower end and consumer grade routers that are starting to do 10 gigabit now, but likely this processor is still going to be a lot faster than most of those devices will be. And while this system is quite a bit more power hungry, I think 80 to 100 watts is still reasonable for a lot of high-end home network situations, but this really depends on where you are and how much you have to pay for power. Now let's take a look at how well this system works as a router. The first thing I wanted to test was compatibility. Just see how well this works with different router operating systems like pfSense, OpenSense, and Untangle. And I tried all 3 of those operating systems on this system, and they worked plug and play without any issues. All the network jacks showed up, and would just automatically link at 10 gigabit with compatible systems. It was great to see they're all plug and play, as well as just desktop Linux distributions and Windows if you want to use those other operating systems. This board didn't have any compatibility issues or network card issues when using it. The next thing I wanted to test was performance and see how well it could actually maximize those connections. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a 10 gigabit WAN connection to actually test with. So I did a little bit of testing with some servers set up on the WAN side and LAN side and just see how well it would pass traffic. And I used a few tests like iPerf plus SMB shares and a few other things to just push traffic through this box. Under a simple network situation while just using a single iPerf stream, I was typically able to get in the 8 gigabits per second range with essentially no additional configuration on this box, and relatively low CPU usage, typically in the 10 to 20% usage range. I tried turning on Snort to enable a few more features and have it look at traffic, and doing that would keep the speed at roughly the same 8 gigabits per second range, although with about 50% CPU usage and a bit more power consumption. The fans didn't rev up in this case in that testing though. And while this hardware is a bit older, this processor still looks pretty good compared to a lot of the Intel Atom class hardware and Xeon D class hardware, which is found in a lot of other commercial routers off the shelf. Let me know how I can improve my router testing in the comments below if there's any other tests you'd like to see on future videos if I look into more routing and routing-like solutions. I think overall my conclusion with this system though is that it works pretty well as a 10 gigabit router. You can't expect it to turn on every feature and max out 10 gigabit, but in a lot of lighter situations it'll handle 10 gigabit fine, and still handle well over gigabit for a lot of the more advanced solutions where you're running more processor-intensive VPN and similar tasks. And I think the system works pretty well as a router if you're looking for something that can have multiple greater than 1 gigabit ports at a relatively low price. And I typically don't like to talk about price for units like these because they can change significantly, especially with hardware like this that's found on the used market. But just for reference, this system, the enclosure with CPU and memory, is less than about $300 used currently, which is a pretty good deal and cheaper than almost every other 10 gigabit capable router on the market. And as long as you're willing to do a little bit of DIY work, deal with some of the compromises like not being able to link at 2.5 and 5 gigabit speeds, either deal with the louder noise of this 1U enclosure or put it in your own enclosure and deal with the slightly odd form factor, and deal with the higher power consumption, this system makes a lot of sense. Let me know what you think of a board like this and how you like to manage your router. Do you want to go DIY, or do you just get an off-the-shelf solution? Also, let me know any other comments or thoughts you have on this video in the comments below, and thanks for watching.